The Bad Bathmat by Stephen Sinclair. When Tommy had just turned 5, he wandered out his house one autumn night on his own. He'd thought he heard voices calling to him. The voices had called to him quietly and insistently. They sounded a bit like the wind that sometimes sighed through the bare branches of the trees outside his window. Somehow the voices had conveyed to him the promise of mischief and the doing of things you were not supposed to do. This appealed to him deeply. Although he was only 5, he already knew the delights of bullying other kids and throwing stones at cats. Tommy was the bane of his pretty, just qualified 20-something teacher's life. Miss Jones believed wholeheartedly, in the orthodoxy she'd been raised with, that there is no such thing as a bad child, but Tommy pushed her. As he pushed everyone. Just the other day he'd shouted out to the entire class that Miss Jones has a big floppy chest. She had nearly cried and blushed bright red, whilst bravely refusing to think of the little boy's expression as a leer. Tommy did not really understand much of what the voices said. One thing that amused him was that he could make out what he thought of as his big name. Clearly he heard the words, "Stop doubting Thomas and believe." Then laughter. The laughter sounded like the tinkling of little bells far away, whilst at the same time being unmistakably that of voices. It gave him the shivers, but it also drew him. No one noticed when he left the house. His mum was pissed as per usual, and his latest uncle was off down the boozer. In the end, he wandered about half a mile to the northern edge of the estate, into a field overlooking the motorway, in an area that was known locally simply as the Round. This was no more than many crumbling stone blocks that barely protruded above the soil. Set out in a huge, roughly circular pattern, the place was not even a good spot for the big kids to get drunk, as it was all overgrown with brambles and nettles. Mostly people paid no attention to the spot. Old ruins are, after all, 10 a penny in southern England. Old Mr. DePore, from a few doors along, found Tommy and took him home. In his mum's words, he was in a right state, all nettles stung and scratched up. Clad only in his pajamas and wrapped up in Mr. DePore's old coat, he shivered with a mixture of the cold and what was apparently complete terror. He had wet himself. No sense could be got from him. His speech seemed to have been knocked back 2 years. When questioned, he would only repeat a series of nonsense words, eyes round and starting from his face, the most often repeated of these being what sounded like Domino Bathmat, and he bad Bathmat. This and screams. For days after, he gave his mother a trying time. Or as she phrased it, a bloody awful time. Waking up, screaming in the middle of the night that the Bad Bathmat men were going to get him. In the end, his uncle had to give him a bit of a slap to shut him up. Although Mr. DePore had brought him home, Tommy didn't like him. Nor did he grow to like him. There was nothing suspicious in the fact that Mr. DePore had been the one who found him that night, the man known to be in the habit of walking there in the evenings. Perhaps Tommy came to resent him for having seen him in such a pathetic and vulnerable state. It probably didn't help that Mr. DePore was not popular on the estate. People said he talked posh. It was said that he had more books in his house than the bloody library. What's more, the said house wasn't even bought. DePore was known to have worked for years in a poxy job for the council in the town hall. Some found him too Essex, which is to say too local. He was known to have deep roots in the county. He was not part of the London diaspora like what normal people are. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was even rumoured he was off the gentry. There had even been an old drunk who hung around the Two Knights pub, who was sometimes heard to hail him as Sir de Lapper. Nobody took this seriously, however. Not only was the old soak another bumpkin, he was also half Scottish and therefore, like all Celts, likely to go off on one. Mostly DePore was disliked because he was infuriatingly polite and walked around like he thought he was someone. But perhaps the real reason he came to hate him was that Tommy dreamed. Every so often after that night, he dreamed the same dream. He dreamed he was in a dark place and Mr. DePore was also there. Mr. DePore was talking to someone, or perhaps more than one person. Tommy didn't know because he couldn't and resolutely wouldn't look. It was typical of a dream because it didn't make any sense. Firstly, because although the words didn't seem to be English, Tommy could understand them. Mr. DePaul was saying, "I invoke my rights. I invoke protection for this child. I will make recompense. In his name, I invoke protection. Recompense." Tommy thought it was a stupid dream. He could, he said, not remember nothing about that night. The winter of that year was remembered as a funny, unsettled one in the town. The high school went on fire. The kids were pleased. A big blaze, only just brought under control. Although obviously set, there was none of the usual signs that it was youths. One of the local Catholic churches was also set alight. That did burn to the ground. Old Father Murphy was badly hurt trying to get the host out the sacristy. Much, much worse, however, was the spate of disappearances amongst people's cats and dogs. Finally, some of these turned up dead on waste ground down by the river. It was rumoured that some sick bastard had cut off their heads. Probably there were other unsettling things that might once have been taken as signs. Certain events on the farms, things seen around the moon. Dreams, many unsettled dreams. But there was no one in modern times to read them. The years passed. Little Tommy became Big Tommy. By the time he was 18, he was a hulking bruiser and the terror of the estate. Now he was the one who gave people a slap. Soon, and perhaps inevitably, he got both excluded from school and heavily involved with the cross-county gangs. He was soon dealing. The passage of time did not make him better disposed to Mr. DePaul. Rather the opposite happened. Nor were Tommy's feelings mitigated by the fact the man was increasingly feeble. Like all thugs, this had rather the opposite effect on him. There is a pecking order in any community. To be considered a loner put you in line for being considered a grass. And from there lay a short journey to being considered the worst thing of all. That this wasn't logical, of course, made it more convincing. It was relatively easy for Tommy to get some of the younger kids to make up the stories about Mr. DePaul. The results were actually a bit disappointing. DePaul was now so old that he wasn't much of a target. He was just a harmless old man who was still seen to totter into the north field and collect rubbish in a bin bag. He got called a few names, but nobody's heart was really in it. He remained infuriatingly polite to everyone. Because Big Tommy had it in for him, nobody was that surprised when the old man got jumped. Nobody had any doubt who'd done it. Nobody said anything. The old man died in the hospital from the beating. His last words, muttered indistinctly, barely heard by a nurse, were, "I revoke my protection." About a month later, Tommy was fleeing from the police in a stolen car. He was of course well known to the police, and not only was the motor nicked and full of gear, Tommy was also banned from driving. He had no intention of letting the pigs catch him. The squalid events are all too common. It was of course a dark autumn night. He'd ended up smashing the passenger side into a tree. He managed to get out and ran up an embankment and into some bushes. He'd been a bit relieved. Congratulated himself on managing to shake them off far easier than expected. At first, he didn't know where he was. Then, by the light of the full October moon, he recognized the round. It seemed to be incredibly quiet there. He almost wished he could still hear the police sirens. He was crouched there in the dark when he heard the chanting. From behind him, faint but growing clearer. Voices. It wasn't really in Tommy's vocabulary, but although the noise reached his ears, it didn't seem to need the air as a medium. This was only a momentary impression. He just listened. Nostra de pater, nostra alma mater, pauperis equitus, sacrificius oblatio. Tommy got to his feet and turned. He had no choice. Just as it seemed inevitable that he should be here in this place. And not alone. Slowly he turned. Veritas Dominus Baphomet, Veritas Dominus Baphomet. He saw it clearly in the moonlight. Far too clearly, as if it was invisibly illuminated from within. Clad in the decaying no-colour remains of what had once been flowing robes. The coif of a rusting chainmail hauberk covered the head. Perversely, the sword it carried in skeletal fingers was free of rust. Damascus steel glimmered blue-silver. Tommy's bladder let go. He never felt it. The others appeared almost casually, many others. They brushed aside the fact of their own deaths with ease, as they emerged from behind doors and walls that had long ago actually ceased to exist. They were grinning, he could tell. This was strange because they had no faces. Perhaps it was because of the way their lower jaws lolled open, bone and teeth. They were, nevertheless, grinning. They formed a semicircle on either side of the first one, and facing Tommy. They became horribly still. Then they made him see things. He saw. They took his mind and made him see, held him, and rubbed his nose in the images of the past. His mind was deliciously unsuited to this and began to crumble. Unhappily not fast enough. He saw the half-dozen bonfires that had been lit before a local church that was still standing over 800 years later in the nearby town. He saw the mob that had howled for their deaths. But not before the people had taken shears and blunt knives to the long hair and beards they of all monks were allowed to wear, lest another blasphemy be added to the already heavy ledger, so that they died in the flames with faces already covered in rivulets of blood. He saw them burn. He recognized the crowd that killed them in a kind of strange but fundamental way. He recognized a few faces whose resemblance was still there in living descendants. Still basically children whose church exploded with color and images like a Hindu temple. The people were already possessed of a sullen fury that was very Anglo, precursor of the red rage that would one day sweep across the world. Then they took him deeper. They had of course not killed them all. The people were too superstitious for that, and many of the condemned had important connections. Instead, they had followed the long years, slow years, locked away in other religious orders, or in the manors and castles of relatives. Remember, in this family we don't talk about father's youngest brother. Old age and disease had been allowed to do their work, and wasn't this in some ways worse than the fires? Because they had never ceased to yearn for their sweet lord. Tommy saw it all. Finally, they allowed him to see their evil. It struck him. Someone once wrote that the connection between true wickedness and the usual run of human misdemeanors is as weak as the connection between great literature and the ABC. Tommy had always had a little dregs of true wickedness. It was what had drawn them to him. But these things, and the men they had once been, had cups that ran over. Even the murder of Mr. Duport was trivial compared to it. The pure evil that is so pure, it's almost the same as innocence. Tommy understood and began to scream. Terrible screams that tore at his lungs and throat and emerged silently from his gaping mouth. He collapsed to the ground, his features a rictus of terror twitching. His face looked as if it was trying to crawl from his skull. He made pathetic warding off, pushing away gestures with his hands. Part of him felt their delight. For them it was a hymn of praise, a thank offering poured out in honor of Baphomet, supreme god of desolation and secret knowledge. Finally, the silent screams stopped. He could only lay there helpless as the first one he'd seen walked forward. It looked down on him with empty eye sockets that held a darkness that somehow actually seemed to glint. Slowly the head tilted, and until it rested on one shoulder. Somehow this was unspeakably horrible, obscene. It spoke to him in a language he understood, but that was not English, rather an archaic ancestor. "Little serf, you are fortunate, very lucky for a Saxon boy. For the poor knights of the Temple of Solomon have chosen you to be our playfellow. We are going to—" It went on speaking for some time, but by then Tommy was insane. The police found what was left of Tommy by the side of the road. His limbs and internal organs had been spread out into a roughly cruciform pattern. The youngest police constable was violently sick all over what was left of him. But they never found Tommy's head.